We don't get a complete copy of the Gospel of John until, again, around the year 200. But we do have this little scrap. Most of the manuscripts we have are not anywhere near this early, though. We start getting full manuscripts at the beginning of the 3rd century, around the year 200, 150, 170 years after Jesus' death. These are about 120 years after most of these books had been written. And we don't start getting numerous manuscripts until the 7th, 8th, or 9th centuries. And then we start getting lots of them, because then you've got monasteries where monks are spending their days copying manuscripts. And we have a lot of their manuscripts. And so 5,700 manuscripts, some of them going back into the 2nd century, none of them being the originals, or within a few years of the originals. So with all of these differences, with all of these manuscripts, how many differences are there? Throughout the Middle Ages, it appears that the scholars didn't realize that there was a problem of not having the original text, or very few scholars realized that this was a problem. Even the scribes copying the text, they sometimes would realize there were differences in the manuscripts they were copying, but they didn't make a very big deal about it. The first time somebody made a really big deal about this was exactly 300 years ago this year, in the year 1707. There was a scholar named John Mill at Oxford. I think he's unrelated to the Victorian John Stuart Mill. This John Mill was a scholar of the Bible, and he had spent 30 years looking at manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, this is obviously after the invention of printing, and printers have to decide what text they're going to print. And the problem is they've got manuscripts that have differences among them. And so how does the printer decide which manuscript to print? Well, it's a problem. That's when they started realizing that this was an issue. Well, John Mill wanted to produce a printed edition of the Greek New Testament. He spent 30 years looking at the manuscripts available to him. He had available to him 100 manuscripts, approximately 100 manuscripts. And he printed up his edition of the Greek New Testament, in which he'd give a verse, and then at the bottom of the page he would indicate the places where the manuscripts differed from one another for that verse. To the shock and dismay of many of his readers, when John Mill produced his edition of the Greek New Testament, it included an apparatus at the bottom of the page that cited 30,000 places where the manuscripts differed from one another. 30,000 places where there were manuscript variations among the manuscripts that he had discovered. And the striking thing is, John Mill didn't give all of the differences he found. He only cited the differences that he thought were significant. Some of his detractors claimed that John Mill was working to render the text of Scripture uncertain. His supporters pointed out that he didn't create these differences. He simply noticed that they exist. So what do we know today about the numbers of mistakes in our manuscripts? Well, Mill looked at 100 manuscripts, and now we have 5,700 manuscripts. Nobody knows how many differences there are among the manuscripts that we now have, because nobody yet, even with the development of computer technologies, nobody has been able to add up all of the differences. Sometimes scholars guess there may be a couple 100,000 differences. Some people say 300,000. Some say 400,000. There are different guesses. The way I usually put it to my students is in comparative terms. There are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. More differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Well, this obviously creates a problem. If you want to know what Mark actually said, and all you've got are copies of Mark that are hundreds of years later that have so many differences in them, how can you possibly reconstruct it? Well, that is a problem. Now, having said that we have these hundreds of thousands of differences, I want to emphasize a particular point, which is most of these differences that we have in our manuscripts are completely insignificant, unimportant, and don't matter for a thing. Many of these differences in the manuscripts are so unimportant that you can't replicate them in translation. Okay? In other words, it's like they changed the word order in Greek, where you'd have to translate it the same way no matter what the Greek word order is. So, I mean, it doesn't really matter very much. By far, the vast majority of these hundreds of thousands of differences are significant for nothing more than showing that scribes in antiquity could spell no better than my students can today. And scribes, of course, didn't have spell check. Scribes, in fact, didn't even have dictionaries. And many scribes didn't care how they spelled anything. Sometimes you'll be reading a manuscript and there'll be the same word that occurs, say, 3 times within a couple of lines. And the scribe will spell the same word 3 different ways. He just doesn't care how the word is spelled. Well, so, you've got lots and lots of those kinds of changes. And what do they matter for? They don't matter at all. So, having said there are all these hundreds of thousands of differences, I want to stress that most of them don't matter for very much. Some of these changes, the ones that don't matter, basically, are accidental mistakes. Scribes were sometimes tired or sleepy. Sometimes they were distracted. Sometimes they were inept or unqualified. And they made mistakes. They would leave out a word. They'd leave out a verse. Sometimes they'd leave out a page. They just made mistakes sometimes. One of the common mistakes of scribes is actually kind of interesting. Sometimes, in the New Testament, you'll have a saying where you'll have 2 lines that end with the same words. Like Jesus in Luke chapter 12 says that whoever confesses me before people will be confessed before the angels of heaven, and whoever denies me before people will be denied before the angels of heaven. So you've got 2 lines that end with the words before the angels of heaven. And what scribes sometimes would do is they'd copy down the words before the angels of heaven on the first occurrence, and then, they'd copy it down, then their eye would go back to the page, and their eye would alight on the second occurrence of the same words. Thinking that that's what they had just copied, they'd go then to the next line and start copying there, and as a result, they would leave out the intervening line. See how that works? That kind of phenomenon is where your eye skips from one line to another. It's called parablepsis. Parablepsis. And when you have words that end the line the same way, that's known as homoteleuton. So this kind of mistake is called parablepsis occasioned by homoteleuton. It's on my final exam at Chapel Hill. Probably the most egregious mistake in any manuscript of the New Testament, one of my favorites, is in a manuscript that's manuscript 109. It's 109 because it's written on parchment and animal skin instead of papyrus, and it's the 109th manuscript that was cataloged. This is a 10th century manuscript that was written by a scribe who wasn't paying attention, and this scribe was copying the Gospel of Luke. Now, the Gospel of Luke is one of the 2 Gospels in the New Testament that has a genealogy of Jesus. Genealogies usually aren't the favorite reading of my students at Chapel Hill. And I think probably it wasn't the favorite reading of this guy because he wasn't really paying attention to what he was doing. But, in Luke's genealogy is actually fairly interesting because in Matthew's the other gospel that gives the genealogy of Jesus, and it traces Jesus' line all the way back to Abraham, the father of the Jews, in Matthew. Luke doesn't stop there. Luke keeps going. Luke traces Jesus' genealogy all the way back to Adam, as in Adam and Eve. This is a fantastic genealogy. I've got an aunt who's a genealogist who's traced my family, back to the Mayflower. The Mayflower, Adam and Eve. so it's, Jesus is supposedly the son of Joseph, who's the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, who's the son of David, son of Jesse, son of so-and-so. It goes all the way back. Isaac, son of Abraham, back to, Seth, son of Adam, who's the son of God. Okay, this genealogy goes all the way back. So, the scribe of manuscript 109 is copying a manuscript that evidently gave the genealogy in 2 columns. 2 columns. But the second column didn't go to the bottom of the page. It only went partway down, the second column. So the first column, second column, partway down. And the scribe apparently didn't realize that this genealogy was in 2 columns. And so he copied across the columns. Instead of copying one column, then the other column, leading to some very interesting results. As it turns out, Adam isn't the first human being. There was a man named Phares, who's the father of the human race. And as it turns out, God is the son of Aram. So it happens. These kinds of mistakes are just pure accidental mistakes that scribes mess up in places. There are other kinds of mistakes that are what I think are probably intentional mistakes. I differentiate between accidental mistakes where scribes just slip up and intentional mistakes where it looks like scribes are actually trying to change the text. Now, I don't know for sure that scribes are trying to change the text. I don't have any scribes around to interrogate about the matter. But there are some changes that don't look like they could possibly simply be a slip of the pen. And there are others that are debatable, whether they were a slip of the pen or not. But let me give you a couple of examples, and you'll see that some of these look like scribes maybe wanted to change the text. I'll give you a couple for instances. In Mark chapter 1,